Okay, well, hello everyone. I'm Joe Palca from NPR, and we're here talking with Wendy Williams, the author of The Language of Butterflies, and Edward Melillo, the author of The Butterfly Effect. And Edward goes by Ted, so that's what we'll call him. And Wendy, I guess we should start with you. Tell us, you've written on various topics. What drew you into butterflies?
It was an accident, really. I intended to write a book about successful conservation stories because there's a lot out there, and I wanted to know why they're successful, what makes them different. But I started with butterflies. I started by going to a site west of Albany, New York, called the Pine Bush Preserve. And the story there was so absolutely fascinating that I just got deeper and deeper into that story. I kind of get absorbed by things that I start to look at and think about. And I realized that the whole story of butterflies itself was fascinating. There's a lot of new science in the last 10 years that really hasn't been presented to the public. And some of it's just amazing. It comes from our modern microscopes, where we can look at things on a tiny, tiny, tiny level and see things that no one ever imagined. So it was, I have a chapter in the book called Down the Rabbit Hole. And I think that's really about me. I fell down the rabbit hole when it came to butterflies.
How long did this take? Because you went to various places. It must have taken a bit of time to do the research.
I usually take 2 years to research a book. I don't like the feeling of being pressured. I don't like the feeling of something that I feel like I should have looked at and I neglected. And also, I want to have fun. For me, writing books is actually a lot of fun. I get to meet new people and think about new things. And sometimes I have to begin at the beginning. So I have to really do a lot of reading and a lot of talking to people. It takes a lot of patience, and I enjoy that. I used to do jigsaw puzzles, 1,000-piece or 5,000-piece jigsaw puzzles. And to me, writing a book is the same as doing a jigsaw puzzle, only it's even more fun because you don't have to stay in your living room.
Ted, I picked up your book and assumed I was going to read. I have to confess, I read Wendy's first. It reminds me of the old joke, "What's the matter? You don't like the other tie?" I had to pick one to read first. It was a toss-up. But anyway, I started on yours and was expecting to hear all about butterflies as well. And I'm not going to say it was a bait and switch, but it certainly has more to talk about in the insect realm than just butterflies. So why the title?
So the title is a reference to a quote from chaos theory pioneer Edward Lorenz. He gave a speech in 1972 to a group of scientists in Boston talking about the hallmarks of chaotic behavior. And one of them is that small causes can have elaborate downstream effects. And the subtitle of the book is more indicative of what the book's actually about: insects in the making of the modern world. And so if you're looking for butterflies, you might want to go to Wendy's book. But if you want to know about the wider world of other insects, that's where I come in. And the book deals with basically the centrality of insect bodies to our everyday lives and many of the institutions that we think of as resolutely modern. Turns out that genetic science, pollination of agricultural crops, and the future of food are all linked to insects, as are some surprising commodities that are in everyday products we're consuming on a regular basis. And so the book explores, how did insect bodies become so central to our life in the modern world?
You say in the introduction or the foreword that, in a way, this book is something your whole life has prepared you to write. What did you mean by that?
Well, I'm very lucky. My dad is an ecologist in Woods Hole, Massachusetts, and my mom, who founded a small private school there, is a history and English teacher. And so I come by environmental history honestly. I'm really interested in how humans in the past have interacted with nature, and I was fortunate to do a lot of field ecology with my dad growing up in places as diverse as Sweden, China, the Harvard forest. And then I had my mom to give me the other side of the equation. So the book draws upon both culture and nature in building its narrative. And when I was 11, I took courses at the Woods Hole Children's School of Science. And there I was exposed to a really wonderful course taught by entomologist Becky Lash, in which she set a monarch butterfly on a wedge of watermelon, and I watched it suck the juice out of that watermelon through its proboscis, and I was entranced. And then I've had a number of experiences throughout my life that have led me back to insects. And finally, I found myself in a position where I could actually write a book about all that. So I did just that.
So, Wendy, you said that there was a lot of modern science that has brought new insights into the butterfly. But one of the things I was really struck by in your book was the description of this, was it 17th century naturalist, 16th century naturalist woman who traveled to the Americas and made remarkable insights into butterflies and other insects. Can you say a little bit about her?
Oh, I could say a lot about her. Maria Sibylla Marion. She was in the 1600s. She was born during a time when lots of women in Europe and in New England too were being burned as witches. Women were not supposed to step out of line and be individuals in those days, but she must have just been born with a different nature because she was naturally curious and she pursued her curiosity, which of course is why I loved her. And she was fortunate enough to be born in the middle of that turbulent time into a household that actually published books. And in those days, publishing books meant everything. You did everything. You edited the book, you helped the person write it, you set the type, you did the art, you put the book together. It was the whole shebang all in one place. So from the time when she was very young, she was listening to very smart, intelligent people come to her house and talk about ideas with her father. Of course, her mother was in the kitchen. And Maria was fascinated by those ideas. At the same time, she was a girl and she wasn't allowed to go out and act on those ideas. She couldn't go to college, or what was college in those days. She couldn't do research. She couldn't even paint with oil paint. She had to paint with watercolors. But she turned out to be a real artist with watercolors. Her job from the age of 5 was to fill in the art that her father literally paint in, watercolor paint in, the art that her father put in the books. Because in those days, of course, printing presses couldn't produce color, so the pictures had to be hand painted. And that's what Maria did as soon as she could hold a paintbrush. So she was excellent at her craft. And then later on, as she got older, she wasn't allowed to roam. So she spent time in her mother's garden and started looking at caterpillars there. This was unheard of in those days for people to study caterpillars. But what had just been invented was a new thing called a microscope, not like our modern microscopes, but enough so that she could see details that nobody else had ever seen before. So she started creating the art. She drew the caterpillars, she drew the leaves on the plants that they used, she drew the chrysalises, and then she even drew the amazing butterflies that emerged from the chrysalises. She wasn't allowed to publish, but she was a publisher, so she published her own books, not in the scientific journals. She published her own books, and the first book that she published was a compendium of 20 years of this art that I just described, and it became an instant bestseller all across Europe. So she was fascinated with butterflies, and then she moved to Amsterdam, which even then was cool as now. And there she met a woman who was quite wealthy and collected butterflies from the New World. These butterflies frustrated her because they were dead and pinned in boxes. Maria wanted to know what these butterflies did. So she sold everything she owned. She and her daughter got on a boat and self-financed the first independent field excursion to the New World. And by independent, I mean no king, no company, nobody sent her. She just went there on her own by herself to find out what in the world these butterflies were up to in South America. So I fell in love with her, of course.
No, it's an amazing story. And what was interesting was that Ted, you actually talk about her as well. How did she impact your story? I'm assuming it had something to do with silk, but maybe I'm wrong.
No, I just wanted to make sure she's gotten the recognition she deserves. In academia, she certainly has, but I'm not sure in the popular imagination, she's a common reference point for most people. And she's a remarkable figure, as Wendy's already said. And one of the things that she did was she displayed for the first time all the parts of an insect's life cycle in the space of one image. And that was revolutionary. People had previously thought that different phases of an insect's life cycle were actually different organisms. And Maria also put insects in a context with their background host plant, say a flower. And previously, most illustrators had shown an insect bereft of any context. And that's a remarkable shift in the history of science, in fact. And so I think Wendy and I are both in agreement that we want Maria to receive the accolades that she certainly deserves. And partly because she was a woman, she has not received those accolades. And so I think both of us were intrigued by how important she was to the world of science and entomology at the time.
So Wendy was talking about how Maria had to use watercolors because she didn't have access or wasn't allowed to use oil-based or other kinds of paint. But one of the stories in your book is about how an insect was key to painting or painters in terms of giving them access to a palette of colors. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
So I think what you're referring to is cochineal, which is a hard to pronounce word. The mnemonic device for it is can you coach an eel? My students always like that one. It's a remarkable commodity in world history. People don't know it was actually the second most lucrative traded commodity in the Spanish Empire, only after silver. And Europeans were after red. They really wanted to get their hands on deep, dark reds because that's the color of ecclesiastical vestments. And it's a color of power in Europe for most of history. And there were some red pigments available to European artists and fabric dyers prior to this, also many of which came from insects. But cochineal is an insect that grows on nopal cacti in Latin America and had been cultivated by Aztecs and Mayans and their predecessors in the Peruvian highlands for thousands of years. And you make this deep scarlet red by crushing the female bodies of cochineal insects. It takes about 70,000 female insects to make a 1-pound brick of the stuff. And then it was an extremely precious commodity back in Europe because, as you said, artisans were seeking these deep scarlet hues with fixative powers that cochineal provided. And so the Spanish basically used indigenous production systems for this bug to create a massive export market. And Spain had a 250-year monopoly on the cochineal trade to Europe until a biopirate, a botanist named Nicholas Joseph Thierry de Menonville, snuck into New Spain, as Mexico was known at the time, and stole cochineal bugs and absconded with them to Saint-Domingue, which is modern-day Haiti. And then that began to open up the cochineal trade so that it wasn't just the province of the Spanish Empire. So I tell that whole story in the cochineal chapter of the book because it's fascinating and very intriguing.
Your book talks a lot about the utility of insects. And oh, by the way, before we leave this, you called the cochineal a bug. And I wrote about insects once and used the word bug and got a whole raft of hate mail. So maybe you can explain why that hate mail comes in and why it's okay to call insects bugs sometimes, even if it's not precise.
Right. I use this is a colloquial term, bug. True bugs are actually, and scientists will tell you, they're part of the taxonomic order of Hemiptera, which includes aphids and cicadas, and they have to be a particular type of insect to be a true bug for an entomologist to consider them thus. Although in the United Kingdom, bugs are simply a synonym for bed bugs often. But we use bug in the United States sort of interchangeably with insect to mean common insects. Although cochineal bugs are actually true bugs of that taxonomic order. So in that case, it's entomologically precise. But The distinction is important in the scientific community for that fact.
Okay.
But it turns out that cochineal is in everything, everyday products that we're consuming on a daily basis. If you've eaten crab meat at a sushi restaurant, or fruit on the bottom yogurt, or ruby red grapefruit juice, or had a drink cocktail mixed with Campari, you've consumed an insect product. It's cochineal dye, and it's regularly used in sausages, all sorts of other products where people won't even know they're consuming an insect, but it's ubiquitous in our everyday lives. And part of the story I'm telling in the book is why many insect products, it disappeared in the post-war era because scientists came up with industrial substitutes for them, have made a reappearance in our everyday lives. And it's largely because those substitutes turned out to be carcinogens. They were toxic, and these insect products are, in many cases, non-toxic alternatives. And so there's been a resurgence in products like shellac and cochineal that are now everywhere. And many people won't even know that, when you're painting your nails or putting on hairspray, you're spraying your body or painting your body with an insect product. Or when you're consuming a shiny apple from the grocery store, it's likely been coated in shellac. And so these things are everywhere, all over the place. The same is true with silk. It had a resurgence as well after nylon seemed to have conquered it after the Second World War. It's now back. And so part of the story I'm telling in the book is why these insect products have had such a resurgence.
So, Wendy, is the butterfly or any of the butterflies that you write about, are they valuable commercial entities, or are they just beautiful things to behold?
I would say they're beautiful things to behold. I'm sure there are some people, well, let me put it this way. There is an illicit butterfly trade. People do still go in and wrestle butterflies that are rare or beautiful and sell them on the black market. Not as much as there used to be, but it's still out there. It's been a problem. In Britain, they tried to, or they have successfully brought back a very beautiful, highly endangered butterfly that's important in Britain, very popular in Britain. But the issue is now they have to protect these butterflies because there are people who have gone in and been caught, by the way, have gone in and captured the butterflies and sold them on the black market. So I don't know that butterflies are lucrative in the way that Dr. Melillo is talking about, but yes, they can be worth a lot of money.
Yeah.
We hope that's tamped down.
And you mentioned when we started talking about the insights that modern science has brought to the understanding of butterflies, and actually I don't know if you were referring to this, but you were talking about how or why the blue morpho butterfly is blue, and the suspicion is there's some pigment, but you say no, and what's that about?
No, there isn't a pigment. That's what's fascinating about it. I was talking about the very primitive microscope, which we wouldn't see as a microscope now probably, that Maria Sibylla Marion was so fascinated with. But now in the modern world, we have these incredibly powerful microscopes that can let us see on tiny, tiny, tiny levels. And when researchers began looking at the scales of butterflies, they found out that color comes not from pigments. You wouldn't be able to grind them up and turn them into blue the way that you're talking about, but actually from the shape of the outer shape of the scale itself. Remember, scales are so small that they're powdery, and researchers have to wear masks when they work with them because otherwise they'll develop lung problems. But when they started looking at these tiny little scales, they found these intricate shapes on the surfaces of the scale. And it's the way these various scales bend to the light or refract the light that makes us think that there are colors there. There's not a color as in a pigment, but it just changes the light for us. And that's why when a blue morpho flies in front of you, it'll seem to change colors even as it flies because the angle of the light that it's refracting changes. So I think that's the basis of our hypnosis about butterflies, of our fascination with them, because the human brain evolved to just love color. We're addicted to it. And where can you find color that's more beautiful than in butterflies?
Yeah. So after writing the book, and I know when you ask this question, you say you love all your children equally, but do you have a favorite butterfly?
Everybody asks me that. And no, I don't have a favorite butterfly. I find even the small, even the cabbage whites, which people sneer at, now I'm interested in them. This is my problem. I'm like Maria Sibylla Marion. I can't stop. If I have to go to South America, I'll go. Now, I like them all, and I like them all for different reasons. I like them all for their beauty and for their unusual habits and for the pretty cool way that they eat, or for their, I talk about the proboscis, what some people would think of as kind of the elephant's nose. It's not at all like that, but that's the best analogy that people know. And the shapes of those proboscises, which were revealed by these incredibly powerful microscopes, is not like anything that anybody ever expected. On the end of some of these, there's actually little saw-like things. I have photos in the book that show you, so that they can come and extend their proboscis into, dare I say it, into the corner of the human eye, so it can suck out eye fluid because it wants those nutrients. They don't do that very often, so be scared.
Good.
Yeah, it's unusual.
No, it's good. Yeah, it is. It's very unusual. Well, Ted, I'll ask you the same question. Is there one insect that moves you in a way that the others perhaps don't?
Well, I'm a pretty big fan of the house cricket. And it's not because it's a particularly unusual insect, but it's because a lot of investors have staked the future of food on it, and it's turning up everywhere. It's in everything. Bill Gates, the Twitter co-founders, one of them, Liz Stone, Mark Cuban, the billionaire investor, they're all putting their money on the house cricket. I'm a little skeptical of some of the prognostications about how everyone will be eating insects in the future, but certainly a lot of us will be eating insect products, and most of it's going to be ground up house crickets and ground up mealworms in the future. Because we're getting to the point where globally livestock production is just remarkably inefficient. If you compare these things, 1 pound of beef in the US takes about 1,000 gallons of water and 2 grazing acres to produce. If you produce an equivalent pound of house crickets, you need about 1 gallon of water and 2 cubic feet of space. And from the house cricket, from a pound of house crickets, you get 2 to 3 times the amount of protein as you do from a pound of beef. And you get more iron, more fiber, and more vitamins. So as we're looking at feeding a world of 9 billion people by 2050, I think if you were to make a bet, you want to be betting on the house cricket there, because it's likely to be a major player in the future of food. And I have a chapter called Entomophagy, the eating of insects, about this exact thing. I mean, about 2 billion people globally right now are eating insects as part of their daily diet. We may think it's sort of repulsive to think about, but some of the football players at Amherst College were eating protein bars that they did not know had cricket meal in them. And then I had them look at the ingredients lists, and indeed, all the protein in those exo bars is coming from basically a flour made of freeze-dried house crickets. So I'm particularly fascinated by the role that insect is going to play in potentially feeding much of the world's population on a hotter, drier, constrained planet.
Well, I'm afraid that's a tasty place to stop, because we've run out of time. Ted Melillo, the author of The Butterfly Effect, and Wendy Williams, the author of The Language of Butterflies. Thank you both so much for talking with me today.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you.